Hey there, what's going on everybody? Welcome back to Cinema Recap. Today we're going to take a look at that action comedy, Big Stan. Now the movie opens up with our protagonist, Stan, attempting to sell a timeshare to an elderly woman. It's obvious that he's not a real realtor. Clearly, he's just trying to scam the poor woman out of her money. Despite her nephew warning against it, she's ultimately won over by Stan's persuasive words of her attracting all the young men in the neighborhood. The idea gets her all hot and bothered.
But the truth is,
you would think that a woman of her wisdom would know better, but even as the police come in and arrest Stan on accusations of fraud, she signs it anyway. Just another victim on Stan's long list of people he's conned.
here you go.
Flash forward in time, and we're in a courtroom for Stan's sentencing. You can tell by his demeanor and smile that he's confident he'll be pronounced innocent. And that confidence gets shut down when the jury pronounces him guilty. Who would have thought? Well, after having some choice of words for the jury and arguing with his lawyer to bribe the judge, he decides to fire his lawyer and hire a different one that he sees on the bench of a bus. Now his new lawyer is full of character, in the white, southern, and racist sort of way, but he is efficient. So the new crooked lawyer was able to bribe the judge with $100 grand in Krugerrand, a South African coin.
Thank you, Judge.
With this bribe, he wasn't able to change the verdict, but he was able to buy Stan 6 months of freedom before his sentencing. Now on paper, it's for organizing a charity for musically inclined autistic children. In reality, it's to buy him time to either make a run for it or get his assets in order, although with $7 million frozen in the bank, Stan can't just leave. So later that night, Stan's stuffing his face with steak, trying to get as much good food in his system before he has to eat that jail food. And with time running out, his wife Mindy offers a proposition. A baby to keep her company while he's gone. Well, you can tell Mindy's a bit of a ditz, but Stan seems to love her anyway. Not so much that he'd be okay with a kid though. He loves her the same way a hungry man loves that sandwich. More a convenient relationship really. He tells her that he'll only be gone for 3 years, 5 max.
We can make a baby.
When he gets out, they'll have to put the kid up for adoption, and that's just cruel. Plus, she'll get those stretch marks and, he wouldn't want that. And Mindy, being the surprisingly independent woman that she is, gets up and leaves him at dinner. To which he tries to compromise and offers her a dog. After she left though. Now the night goes on and Stan finds himself in a dive bar with a bunch of bikers. One in particular sitting right next to him with a prison tat, and Stan's staring gets his attention. Things almost get violent, but Stan explains that he's bound for prison and just wanted some tips. And for $100, the biker eventually does it.
I'll pay you $100.
The two sit down and discuss Stan's situation. Apparently, the prison that Stan's being sent to is one of the toughest there is. And on top of that, the man he's talking to admits that if they were in prison together, he'd most likely force himself on Stan, as a show of dominance. Shocked by this, Stan asks if men really do turn gay in prison. The biker says no, he's always been gay. He tells him that he's in a gay bar after all, as 2 men begin to make out in the background. And the biker goes on to say the act of the R word is an act of violence, not pleasure, and in prison, it's all about violence. Stan is begging him for advice, but the only advice he has is for him to join a gang. And there are only 3 gangs in prison: the Nazis, the mob, and the Latinos. So the Nazis being the only viable option, he decides he'll be racist for a few years, which is good because only the Nazis would be allowed to force themselves on him.
Just to keep up with the Joneses.
But it's not looking good for Stan, and as a last-ditch attempt to make himself look tough enough for prison, he shows off an awful tattoo to the biker. It reads Mommy, with a poorly tattooed face. Well, it might as well say open for business at the rate this is going. With his impending doom, he runs home to Mindy and blacks out drunk. And the next day, he wakes up thinking that it was all a dream, a nice temporary daze. But Mindy quickly brings him back to reality. So determined to prevent anyone from forcing themselves on him, Stan decides to take the matter into his own hands. He buys steroids, enrolls in karate, gets a tat in his nether region to make it seem less attractive, and just in case, he allows Mindy to take his backdoor virginity. Now in the days to come, he advances to yellow belt in karate, but quickly gets humbled when a much smaller and younger green belt kicks his butt very quickly and very violently. In retaliation, he tackles the child to the ground, which understandably gets him kicked out of the dojo. This is where the story really begins.
All right.
Now out on the street, beaten and bloodied, Stan meets the Master, No, that's legitimately his name. He goes by the Master. Stan questions his abilities at first, but when he punches a wall and cracks the brick, Stan's convinced. Stan's decided to be the Master's pupil in exchange for housing and payment at the end of Stan's sentence. When Stan brings him home for dinner, Mindy isn't entirely convinced. In their grand dining room eating their hamburger helper, Mindy questions the Master and his abilities. To which he responds with perhaps what is simultaneously the coolest yet most cliché monologue ever, while holding his hand over a fire unfazed. Young lady, what I teach is not an art, it's a science. A careful amalgam of the most deadly parts of karate, kung fu, Wing Chun, Krav Maga, Muay Thai, Savate, and Filipino Kali, my favorite. I find weakness and turn it into strength. Find fat and turn it into muscle. Find blisters and make them into canker sores. I find doubt, turn it into will.
Any questions?
A statement that amazes Stan but scares Mindy. Despite his wife's doubts, Stan insists that this is the right path. Now, the coming days are filled with strange diets, harsh exercises, and invasion of privacy. Despite all the pain and disgust, Stan lets it go on, with the hopes that he can avoid being taken advantage of in prison. This goes on for like a month before Mindy snaps and insists that the Master leave their house. However, Stan fears his booty being taken is too much. In a cruel attempt to get Mindy to understand his fear, he wakes her up in the middle of the night and tells her there are a bunch of large men in the house. He tells her they have guns and have already killed the Master, and that they're to R-word her. His performance is very convincing, that Mindy begins to cry on his lap, and when Stan finally breaks it to her that he was lying, she snaps. Stan's selfish and inconsiderate personality has wronged Mindy for the last time. At that moment, she decides she's had enough and leaves him right there and then. He tries to argue with her that he's not selfish. I mean, he bought her that boob job that he wanted for her, and he got her the second sports car for him because the first one was too small. His generosity knows no bounds. He's begging for her to stay, but she's not having it. It's only after that he finally agrees to having a baby that she begins to turn around. Although the conversation's more like, fine, we can have a baby. Really? No, not really, but we can visit people that do. And with that, she drives off into the night, leaving Stan behind.
I want a baby.
Now with Mindy gone, he dives deeper into his training, and we get a solid training montage of him progressively getting better at martial arts and eating stranger food. He goes from breaking his fingers on wooden boards to shattering bricks with his fist. Before we know it, Stan's a full-fledged fighter. Before we go on, like the video, smash the subscribe button and turn on that notification bell to get that full day of good luck. On the final night of his freedom, to celebrate his success, he takes the Master and his racist lawyer out to dinner. And there he finds that he's only the second best student the Master has trained. The first and best one apparently used his training for evil, not at all foreshadowing. So Stan brushes off the ominous story and raises a toast to the second best. They cap off the night with Stan fighting and beating his former karate master, proof that he's developed into a true warrior. And on the next day, Stan's being dropped off to turn himself in for processing. There's a slight change in the prison that he's being sent to. He's being sent to Oaksburg instead of Verlaine. It makes no real difference, prison is prison. Now with no word for Mindy or her lawyer about the divorce, Stan says goodbye to the last of his support system and heads inside as Mindy watches him from a distance. So on the bus ride, Stan's hit on by a fellow inmate, and he quickly puts the man in his place. Using his newfound skill, he easily beats up that inmate, impressing a couple of younger prisoners.
This your first time?
Stan and his fellow inmates are processed, and thanks to a new tattoo around his butthole, he strikes fear into the guards checking him. He meets his cellmate, Shorts, an old man with a docile demeanor. Even with him, Stan continues his tough guy act and kicks him out of the top bunk. A decision that's quickly taken back after finding out the old man has an addiction to pleasing himself. Now later in the courtyard, determined to establish himself as the top dog of the prison, he picks a fight with the biggest, buffest predator out there, Big Raymond. The man's massive and dangerous, but no match for the new Stan. Stan makes a mockery of him and breaks all his fingers. This impressive show of strength impresses the Nazi faction, but Stan rejects their invitation, and another fight ensues. Well, the Nazis aren't a match for Stan's skill, and one by one, drop like flies. After making short work of Nazis, the African-American faction steps up to the fight as well. Stan tries to talk him out of it. He's not racist in the least and would actually prefer to stay on good terms with him. But they have to stick up for Big Raymond, and Stan's forced into another gang fight. This time he gets a broom as a weapon and defeats all the incoming attackers. He even lets them use a weapon themselves, but still they're no match. After the majority of the gang is beaten, he punches their leader, Cleon, square in the jaw and knocks out a bunch of his teeth. He tells him to stay in his place, and he impishly agrees. Stan is now the top dog, without a doubt.
I said don't talk that way around me.
His show of strength gets the warden's attention, and the entire prison is put on notice that he's the man now. Later, he's called to the warden's office and given a strangely warm welcome. The warden offers him whiskey and a cigar. As it turns out, the warden himself requested Stan to be transferred to his prison specifically. The land the prison is built on is nice. It has a good view and a strong foundation, and Stan agrees. And here's where things get interesting. The warden has no intention of being a warden forever. He wants to convert the prison into a series of condominiums, a luxury neighborhood that is full of timeshares. Stan's expertise. In exchange for Stan's help in developing his dream real estate property, the warden will shorten Stan's prison sentence down to a year. Corrupt use of power, but Stan loves it and agrees happily. Now, sometime later, Stan gets ambushed in the shower. They try to shank him, but only manage to cut his nipple. Stan easily fights off his attacker with soup nunchucks and leaves him for Big Raymond. Elsewhere, Stan's lawyer continues to struggle with contacting Mindy's lawyer for the divorce, and contacts Stan that he'll have to reach her directly. Stan continues with his exploits, and briefly meets with a Vietnamese mobster that is helping the warden shut down that prison in place of real estate property. The mobster seems to be cooperating, but doesn't take a liking to Stan, thoroughly examining their contract. Stan suggests his lawyer help write up the contract, to which the mobster takes note and moves to examine the inmates. A plan's brewing, and nobody seems to be on the same page.
That could screw you in the long run.
Stan's lawyer is attacked by the mobster's crew, and Stan begins to feel guilt for what's likely going to happen to the prisoners. We learn that Shorts killed his wife when he was drunk. Stan begins to miss Mindy and writes her a letter of apology for the way he treated her. Unfortunately, Mindy has begun to sleep with the master in Stan's absence. In an attempt to distract himself from everything going on, Stan begins to conform the prisoners to be more upstanding citizens. Like a school counselor talking to students, he holds an assembly and establishes some rules for everyone to follow. No violent video games and shows, no music degrading women, no non-consensual intimacy, etc. The prison doesn't entirely agree with it all, but they respect Stan too much and eventually agree.
Shorts, give us a taste.
Stan even finds Big Raymond a boyfriend. With his new set of rules, the prison's looking more like detention than prison. A welcome change of pace for some of the younger non-violent inmates, and they form a gang with Stan as their leader. Now, the changes that Stan implemented wash over the prison like a tidal wave, and before you know it, Stan receives a letter from Mindy. She wants to see him, and he can't be more thrilled to see her again. Gang violence begins to halt. People start making friends. Nazis embrace the black inmates, and they throw birthday parties with toilet punch. It's a half-decent community. However, the changes don't make everyone happy. The warden takes note of how docile his inmates become, and he's not thrilled about it. Now the day of the conjugal visit comes, and Mindy embraces him into her arms as he admits that he was wrong. The two partake in some pleasantries, but the mood is ruined when Mindy tells Stan that she's been seeing the master. He's been teaching her a lot of tricks, and has him to thank for her performance in bed. Understandably, Stan's pissed, and forbids her from seeing him again before he's escorted out of the room.
The master.
Later on, the warden brings Stan into his office and reveals his plans to him. If he's ever to get what he wants, he needs to shut down the prison. And to do so, he plans to stage a prison riot in a week during the prison's annual inspection. He wants to smuggle the prisoners' weapons and let it get to the point that his guards have to fire into the crowd, killing dozens. It's his hope that this scandal will be enough to get the prison shut down and sold to his Vietnamese partner. Although none of that can happen when all his prisoners are nice, outstanding citizens. He needs Stan to stop making it a better place, putting Stan in a tough spot. If he follows the plan, he'll get out soon, but at the cost of many of his friends' lives, a predicament that makes him feel conflicted. When Stan contacts his lawyer, even he's scared of what Stan has gotten himself into. His only advice? Get out as soon as possible. So that night, Stan's dreaming about Mindy and her relationship with the master. The nightmare's enough to sway his decision. He takes up the warden's deal and begins to distance himself from his fellow inmates. He stops solving their issues and initiates an all-out brawl that divides and segregates the prison. Even when he's approached by the young ones, he pushes them away and makes an enemy out of them. His final words of advice is for Shorts to avoid the yard tomorrow. And the next day comes, and all seems to be going as planned. Stan follows through with the deal, and the prison seems to be on the brink of a riot. The board even agrees to see Stan that day. Mindy and the Master show up for support, although they're a little closer than Stan's comfortable with. It appears that Stan's going home. Although minutes from being released, Stan has a change of heart and decides to tank his parole interview and save his fellow inmates. Outside the room, he meets up with Mindy and finds out the Master is actually impotent. They weren't sleeping together and truly have been good friends all this time. Empowered by the good news, Stan fights off the guard and makes a run for the yard. Time's running short and the inmates are given weapons while Stan comes in to blows with the Vietnamese mobster, who's apparently the Master's former #1 student. At first, it may seem the mobster has the upper hand, but using some of the most absurd methods that the Master has taught him and a deadly finger up the nether regions, he's able to come out on top, even after the man brings out a sword. The prison fight seems to be coming to a head, but surprisingly, when it looks like stuff's gonna boil, the prisoners actually break out into a dance party. The warden's plan is ruined, and he absolutely loses it, firing into the crowd of prisoners. Fortunately, the Master has been teaching Mindy, and the two of them are able to stop him. It's over. The warden has lost and is destined for jail. All is right. So 3 years fly by, and the prison's a better place. The young prisoner that clung so tightly to Stan is now teaching other inmates martial arts. The former prison guard is now the new warden. Stan's corrupt lawyer is now an inmate. And Stan and Mindy finally have a kid, with the Master as their nanny.